With the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the entry of Japan into the war, but against the United States, Stalin's position was, as Snyder says on page 211, was rather good. The Japanese had made a choice to fight the United States in the Pacific rather than the Soviet Union on the mainland of Asia. What had happened is, and I haven't really talked about this too much, and I'm not going to go into it in significant detail here, but in 1939, there was a battle at a place called Nomonhan on the Mongolian border. And Zhukov, who was a young general at the time, that was why he wasn't caught up in the purges, he basically massacred, in a wartime sense, he demolished Japanese troops in this battle, and it's almost Namahan is almost completely unknown today. It's almost completely forgotten. But for World War II insiders, the Battle of Nomonhan in 1939 is hugely significant because the Soviets defeated the Japanese pretty handily. And it's at that point that the Japanese army lost prestige, and the Japanese army was the significant force in Japan and China, and the Japanese Navy gained prestige. And long story short, after Nomonhan, the Japanese they came together and decided that instead of trying to conquer Soviet territory, what they would do is they would move into the Pacific arena. And that leads to the attacks on what's now Vietnam, Indochina, then what's now Indonesia, what's the Philippines, Singapore. And so this almost unknown battle in 1939, where the Japanese were defeated by the Soviet forces under the command of the young General Zhukov, who later becomes the commander of all Soviet forces in World War II. It makes the Japanese decide that they're going to fight the Americans rather than fight the Soviets. And we've talked about this, but I'm a big believer in repetition, and you've probably noticed that. It's not just that I'm old, although I am getting old. It's just I just think it's a learning technique. But Stalin doesn't have to fight a true front war. Okay, this is very significant. And this is something you really need to think about when you're thinking about why the Soviet Union was able to prevail over the Nazis, although they barely prevailed over the Nazis. Stalin, unlike Hitler, did not fight a two-front war. Now, Hitler, of course, didn't have to fight a true front war, but he was always after, he'd always planned to capture the western areas of the Soviet Union. And when this is the significance of England hanging on in 1940 and Churchill refusing to surrender, because it forced Hitler to turn east, which is kind of what he wanted to do anyway. It wasn't that hard to force him to turn east. But by Churchill hanging on in Great Britain in 1940, basically he's waiting for the cavalry to arrive in the form of the United States. Although the U.S. is very slow to get there. Think about it. The U.S. really doesn't enter the war in effect till 1942. December 7th, 1941 is basically 1942. So the British are just barely hanging on. The Russians are just barely hanging on as well. But this is just the overarching significance of Churchill persuading the British people to maintain the fight against the Germans. It allows ultimately the U.S. to come into the war on the side of England, and it forces Hitler to turn east. And then what that means is that Hitler has to fight a two-front war. And Stalin, he's able to negotiate with the Japanese. The Japanese decide they don't want to fight him. The Japanese decide that they want to focus on the United States. They don't want to fight in the Soviet Union. And so basically what happens is the Soviet Union and the Japanese sign a non-aggression pact. And the Soviet Union and Japan are technically at peace with each other from all the way up until August 1945, just a couple of weeks before the Japanese surrender. So Stalin manages to avoid a two-front war. This is what allows him to shift troops from Siberia to Moscow in December of 1941. It's just hugely significant. And the other thing is that a good portion of the Lend-Lease supplies that are coming into the Soviet Union are coming into Pacific ports. So as Snyder says, Stalin doesn't have to worry about the Japanese army attacking from the Pacific. What he's getting from his Pacific ports are supplies from the United States. So what you have really here is that with some luck and with some diplomacy, the Germans become encircled by the end of 1941, after Pearl Harbor, and Hitler declares war on the United States. Germany is encircled, whereas the Soviet Union is not encircled. And this strategically played an enormous amount. It played a huge role, a very significant role in the ability of the Soviet Union to hang on against the Nazis. Now, I should say something that's probably implicit in the course, but I'll make it explicit now. When I think of World War II of Europe, obviously I'm thinking of the center chord, the center stage is clearly the Soviet Union, the fighting in the Soviet Union. It's not to say that the U.S. doesn't play a significant role. I'll talk about Lend-Lease in lectures, or I did last week, I can't remember now. Of course, the U.S. will lead an invasion in France in June of 1944. But remember, 80% or so of German soldiers that were killed in World War II were killed by Soviet soldiers. The front lines, the heart of World War II in Europe is the fight in the Soviet Union between the Nazis and the Soviet Union. In the United States today, our memory of it puts the U.S. front and center, and all respect to our fighting men, especially in Europe, the pilots that we're going to read about later in the semester. But the real fighting of the war, the significant fighting, happens in the Soviet Union. And our military knew this. Marshall, the head of the Army in the U.S., George Marshall, he knew this. Roosevelt knew this. The U.S. military was terrified that the Soviet Union was going to be defeated by the Nazis, and that would have really been the end game if the Soviet Union had been defeated. So that's one of the theses of this course, implicit, although it's pretty obvious if you think about it. World War II in Europe is really about the war between the Soviets and the Nazis.